Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ. It is Matthew chapter 14 day, and we are going to get into it really quick. Should be not quite as long a chapter as some of the others. Hopefully we can get through this material a little bit quicker, and I don't drag it out longer than it needs to be. Thank you everyone who's watched the previous videos. I know that they've been long. I know that there's still been people who have watched them and encouraged me, and so thank you very much. Also, if you don't have the notes yet, go out to the website, description below, 2BeLikeChrist.com. Grab the notes for chapter 14. You will want them because there's a lot of names, historical points that are in this chapter that it really is going to help you to have the notes just to keep everything straight and so that you can keep everything in line. So also on the website and on Amazon.com, What is the Bible? Will give you lots of foundational information about the Bible, summaries of every book in the Bible, summary of the Old Testament, the New Testament, main Bible characters, etc., all that good information. You can find that on the website if you're new to the scriptures, you just want a refresher. And here we go, Matthew chapter 14. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was very sorry, but because of his oath and his guess, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took his body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. We've been hearing about John the Baptist sporadically as we've gone throughout the book of Matthew. We were introduced to him very early on, and then in chapter 4, verse 12, we were told that he was arrested. In Matthew chapter 11, verses, really the first part of that chapter, if I remember right. Yeah. John's disciples come to Jesus and they ask him a question for John, their teacher, about whether Jesus is really the Messiah. And they take that word back to John while he's in prison. We discover in Matthew chapter 14 that John has been killed by Herod. The first two verses of chapter 14 tell us that Herod was worried that Jesus was actually John the Baptist raised from the dead. And so he's hearing about Jesus, all these miracles, and he's like, oh no, John has come back, to haunt me. Maybe it was his conscience. Maybe he was worried about his throne or something like this, or maybe God was after him. But there's some worry that Jesus is actually John raised from the dead. And so then it kind of steps back in time to tell what happened to John. We're told a little bit about John's arrest. John had been arrested because there was this woman named Herodias. She was married to Herod the Tetrarch, but she was originally married to Philip, Herod's half-brother. We've talked about this a little bit. I believe it was in chapter 4. And if you want a little bit more information on that, you can go back to chapter 4. But we're going to dig into some historical context here that really helps us to understand what's going on. So, it was in chapter 2 that those notes about Philip and Herod were present. So go back to chapter 2 and look at those. So John boldly opposes this marriage. He says that Herod having his half-brother Philip's wife is not a godly thing. And there's others who write about this, like Josephus, who say that it was even thought of like really negatively in the Jewish culture. So it wasn't just like God and his prophet who were opposed, but this was something that was culturally not done and not really acceptable. But because he was kind of the ruler, he gets away with it. So then because John opposes this situation, he gets himself arrested. Now moving from his arrest to his execution, Herod and Herodias, his new wife, wanted John dead, but the people really respected John. So in a political move, Herod was kind of delaying doing anything to John, thought I'll just keep him in prison and he can't do a whole lot there, and I won't have to deal with the fallout of the people if I kill him. So on his birthday then, Herod threw a party at which his stepdaughter, who secular history tells us her name was Salome, she danced before, excuse me, she danced before Herod and his guests. So this is Herodias's daughter. Dances before Herod, her husband, and, well, let me clarify this because I want to make it clear because there's a lot of names that are going to float around here. So there's Herodias and Herod, and they're in this weird relationship that's ungodly. Herodias has a daughter, and this is the daughter who is dancing at this party, and she pleases Herod, her stepfather. So there we go. Hopefully that's clear. So she impressed Herod so much that he promised to give her anything that she wanted. He said, make a request and I'll give it to you. So apparently there was a consultation between Herodias and her daughter, and Herodias gets her daughter Salome to ask Herod for John the Baptist's head. Herodias hates John. She doesn't like that he goes around condemning her marriage. And so she wants him dead. Herod has delayed that decision, but now the text says that because of Herod's oath and because of the guests who were all, witness to that oath and that promise that he had made to Salome, he is basically forced to give her what she wants. And so he goes and he sends the executioner and cuts off John's head and brings it back to Salome and her mother Herodias at this feast. Now, if I had had the offer to have whatever I wanted, I don't think there's any way that my mother could have talked me into decapitating somebody. I'd rather have something that I can enjoy, like a new boat or a new car or a bunch of money, anything. But somebody's head, that can be sorted out at another time. But this story is a great example of how historical study, secular, external to the Bible, historical study can really give us a much more rich understanding of this decision and why some tension exists between rulers at this time. And so I've put all this in your notes, and this is why you're going to want the notes, because there's dates and there's weird names in here, but it will really open up this text to us. And not only this text, but also as we go throughout the rest of the Gospels and even into the book of Acts, there's some facts that we are going to discover here that tie all of these things together. So let's talk about this. So this text in chapter 14, the very beginning, talks about Herod the Tetrarch. He's the one who's married to Herodias. He stole her from Philip. And his name is Herod Antipas. And from now on, I'm just going to refer to him as Antipas to keep things clear, because Herod was a title. It wasn't like a first name. So his title was Herod, or the ruler, and Antipas, though, is kind of his more specific name. So Herod Antipas. His date of birth was unknown, but it was probably before 20 BC, 20 years before Jesus. And he reigned in Judea from 1 AD to 39 AD. So you think about where Jesus' life falls in there, it falls right, almost the same dates. Jesus' entire life would have fit within the reign of Herod Antipas, and that's important. He reigned in Judea from 1 AD. I already read that. Why am I reading it again? Those roosters are out there crowing again. It's literally 4:22 p.m. It is not the morning. Go away, stupid roosters. Herod Antipas, that's our guy, was the son of Herod the Great. Okay, so that's the guy who killed all the babies in chapter 2. Herod Antipas is his son by a woman named Malthrace. Herod has a brother named Archelaus, and we also read about Archelaus in Matthew chapter 2. Archelaus takes the place of his father when Herod the Great dies, and he is also a son through this woman Malthrace. So Herod Antipas, the guy in chapter 14, Herod Archelaus, the guy in chapter 2, they are full brothers. And then there's Herod the Second, and that is Philip, who Antipas stole his wife from. Okay, Herod 2 is Philip, and he is the half-brother of Archelaus and Antipas. Herod Philip was also the son of Herod the Great, but he was the half-brother through Mariamne II, who was another wife of Herod the Great. So now that you're thoroughly confused, let us continue. Also, one reason you're going to want the notes is because the maps actually really matter. I know I say that all the time, but they really matter when we're talking about this. So Herod Antipas, our guy, he is the ruler of Galilee and Perea. And on the map there, you're going to be able to see where those two things are. So Galilee obviously is west of the Sea of Galilee there. Perea, that's a name that we don't hear as much, but it's on the opposite side of Judea. It is on the east side, bordered by the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. So you'll see it there, a pretty nice chunk of land. Now there's another map here, and I know that the colors are kind of hideous, but they do the job. Antipas's brother Archelaus ruled Judea until 6 AD, according to Matthew chapter 2, verse 22. Antipas's half-brother Philip reigned in the area of the Golan Heights, and you'll see that on the map, Bithynia. And that's also where, we talked about the Golan Heights earlier, where the wind comes off of the cliffs there and down into the Sea of Galilee, and that's what kicks up those terrible windstorms that Jesus has to save the apostles from. So up there, that's where Philip is reigning. And then Archelaus was reigning down in Judea. When we have an understanding of this land division, it brings more clarity to a passage that we already read. You remember in chapter 2 when the babies are all being killed by Herod the Great, and God tells Joseph to take Mary and to go down to Egypt. Okay, so they do that. Then Herod the Great dies. And then where does Joseph and Mary move back to? Do they go back to Bethlehem where Jesus was born? No. Why? Because it says that Joseph feared Archelaus, who was reigning in his father's place. So where do they go instead? They go up to Nazareth. Now, for us, most of us think about that and we're like, okay, well, whatever. But here, this reveals the land divisions and why that was the case. So Herod Archelaus took over Judea. The Roman government, the Roman authorities, I believe it was Augustus, confirmed his rule over Judea. And you notice there that Jerusalem, Bethlehem, they're all under Archelaus's reign. If you go farther north, though, and you go to Nazareth, Nazareth is technically in that Galilee area. And so who's reigning over Galilee? It's not Archelaus, it's Antipas. And so there's a different ruler in those sections. And so don't get all the Herods confused and let that passage confuse you. If you have this on hand, you'll understand why he decided that he was moving up north. It's because apparently he thought Antipas was a somewhat more friendly ruler than his brother Archelaus. And Archelaus did not last long in that position, but he was there when Joseph was making his move. So interesting, I thought. Now, here's some other interesting stuff. Antipas, is married in this ungodly relationship to Herodias. Now, Herodias was previously mentioned to Philip, but divorced him to marry Antipas. Okay, I think we got that fact down. Just want to double be sure so I'm not confusing people. In order to marry Herodias, Herod Antipas had to divorce his wife. Okay, so her name was, I'm going to butcher this, but Phasaelus. That's a horrible name. I'm glad my wife's name is not Phasaelus. That's probably terribly pronounced. You'll see it in the notes. Now, Phasaelus was a Nabatean princess, and that probably means nothing to you because you don't know where Nabatea is. Aha, you need the maps in the notes. So scroll up 2 maps to the actual good-looking map here, and you will see Galilee, you'll see Perea, and then moving down to the southeast, you'll see Nabatea. So Nabatea borders Perea. So it borders one of Antipas's regions over which he was the ruler. Okay? So Herod's first wife, is a Nabatean princess. He has to divorce her to marry Herodias. Do you think her father, the king of Nabatea, was like, oh, okay, I'm okay with that? No. They had arranged this marriage because they were border states. And as an alliance, Herod decided to marry this Nabatean princess. That kept his southeast border of Perea kind of in good standings with their neighbors, the Nabateans. Her father's name was Aretas. And he was so angered. there was already some tension between them, which you can read about if you want to dig in deeper. But there was already some tension between Aretas and Antipas. But this divorce further angered Aretas. And immediately upon the divorce, he started invading on the Perean border. And he started a war there. And that war went so badly for Antipas that he actually had to call in Roman officials to help his military because he was losing to the Nabateans so badly. Now, here's a side note, but another kind of connecting dot to history. One of the 7 wonders of the world is the Al-Khazna, probably butchered that as well, the treasury of Petra. I believe it's in the movie Indiana Jones. I could be mistaken about that, but it's one of the 7 wonders of the world. If you see in the notes, there's a picture of it there, and you've probably seen it before. It's that building that's almost like cut out of the side of a cliff. And it's, as I said, it's one of the 7 wonders of the world, but it's thought that that structure is the mausoleum or the burial place of Aretas, the Nabatean king who invaded Antipas's land upon the divorce of his daughter Phasaelis when divorced to marry Herodias. Aha! So you're like, it all makes sense now. Yeah, right. But just connecting like pieces that have been loose out here for a while, helping to connect them to the Bible excites me at least. And, I think there's some other people who must be excited about that. Surprisingly, one of the most popular videos on my channel has been a video that I made. It's like 45 minutes long. Ancient civilizations and their place in biblical history. And I made it for a Daniel class. I didn't even plan to put it on my channel, and I ended up doing it, and it's got thousands of views now. And so maybe there's more people out there that are interested in biblical history than just me. But I really like connecting all of those pieces and putting them together, and I feel like it opens my eyes to what's going on here in the text. So you can also watch that if that's something that you're interested in. Hop over to the YouTube channel and check that out after this video. All right, moving on. So not only did Antipas marry Herodias and it had moral implications, but there were also political implications, as you may guess, as you think about who this area of the world was under the control of. So these insights may explain the tensions that we find in Luke chapter 23, verse 12, because we're told there that Pilate, the Roman governor, is not friends with Herod. That Herod is Herod Antipas. They don't get along until there's this interaction with Jesus, and Herod kind of passes the buck, and he sends up Jesus to Herod, and he wants him to figure out what's going on with the Jews in this situation. Because you remember, what does he find out? He's like, oh, he's a Galilean. Jesus is a Galilean. So Pilate says, who's in charge of Galilee? Well, you know, because you've got the map. Who's in charge of Galilee? Herod Antipas. So he's like, send him to Herod Antipas. I don't want to deal with this situation. And it says that there was a friendship that was created between Pilate and Herod Antipas. Well, what might have been the tension that existed between them? It may have been that the Herods were given power by the Roman Empire. They were allowed to rule in order to keep this area of the world in check. As long as they could keep it in check, the Romans seemed like they didn't have a problem with some kind of self-rule of the Herods here in Judea. They were like, keep it in line and you can keep your authority. Well, when Aretas and Nabatea invades the Perean border and Herod Antipas has to call Rome for reinforcements, do you think the Romans are really going to be that happy about it? And especially when this is not even like a genuine political or military, it's not motivated by anything worthy of causing a war. Right? It's because Herod is so stupid that he took his half-brother's wife and divorced his other wife, and this is all over a woman. He started a war over a woman in a marriage he shouldn't be in, and so do you think the Romans are going to be pleased with him? No. So that might explain some of the tension that we see here, or see later on in Luke's gospel. All right, so that kind of gets us through most of our historical study. There's one last point I'd like to make, and that's the prison where John was kept. Josephus mentions that John was held at a fortified hilltop palace of Macarius. I think I got that one. Macarius. And that was located on the east side of the Dead Sea. And that was a palace that had been destroyed, but it was rebuilt by Herod the Great. And I have a map there. It's pretty small, but you can still tell just about where that fortress was. So he was probably down there a little bit, halfway down through the east side of the Dead Sea. Let me check that map out. Now, Herod Antipas's fate, and this is, I lied, we have one other historical point to make. Antipas's fate. What happened to Herod? Emperor Tiberius died in 37 AD. He was succeeded by Caligula. Antipas's nephew, who was Herodias's brother, decides he doesn't really like them. He doesn't like that couple. So he's like, okay, he goes to the emperor and he accuses Antipas of conspiring against the new emperor, Caligula. He says, that guy Antipas and his wife, they don't really like you, Emperor Caligula. And so this nephew's name was Agrippa the First. As we mentioned, he was the brother of Herodias, and he rats them out. But you might know that name, Agrippa, if you've ever studied the book of Acts. This is not the same Agrippa that Paul meets in Caesarea. Wherever he appears before Agrippa, this is not the same one. This is actually his father. So this is Agrippa 1. The one Paul stands before is Agrippa 2. And so it's Agrippa's, if you're thinking about the Acts, Paul's Agrippa, it's his father who gets Antipas kicked out of authority. And then his father takes place. And so that's how Herod gets authority. And that's why Paul has to stand before Agrippa when he's there on trial, is because Agrippa's father kicked out Herod, who used to be in control, and now he's in control. Another dot being connected. And if let me just say, if this is your first time studying the Bible and you are like, what on earth is this guy talking about? Don't worry. As we go throughout the rest of the text, and then you come back to a lesson like this, it'll make a lot more sense. As we go through the rest of the Gospels and the book of Acts, you'll be able to connect those pieces. And so even if you're confused, don't worry. You don't need to know those things in order to get your head wrapped around the Bible. That's for some people who maybe have gone through this before. So thanks for sitting and listening to my historical rant. Herod and Antipas then were exiled, and they were sent to Spain, and no one knows exactly when they died. So they're kind of off the pages of history once Agrippa I decides that he's going to accuse them of being a traitor to King Caligula. All right, so now we're finally back to the text of the Bible. Let's read verses 13 and 14. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. It's not 100% clear where Jesus was when he received this news about John's death. He was in Nazareth at the end of the last chapter, but there seemed to be some suggestions that there may have been some events that took place between that event and now. Luke chapter 9, verse 10 names this desolate place as being Bethsaida. And from what I understand, there's not a dead set location as far as archaeologically where Bethsaida was. There's two possible Bethsaidas there on the map. You see they're both on the northeast side, or really the north side of the Sea of Galilee. So he's somewhere over there, about 5 miles from the city of Capernaum where he was based. So either way, no matter where he was, upon hearing this, Jesus took a boat to a desolate place and was followed on foot by the crowds. And you think about this, he let me find that text. He withdrew from there to a desolate place by himself. Apparently, he wanted some time alone. That's what he went to do, to go to a desolate place by himself. But what happens? All these people are following him. Now, I am by nature an introvert, and I need to be just by myself quite a bit, right? I can't be around people all the time, or at least that doesn't come naturally to me. So here, I totally understand this. Jesus has received some bad news, and he wants to go off and be by himself and not be bothered by a bunch of people. And guess what? A bunch of people show up and they follow him on foot. Now, did Jesus know that was going to happen? Yeah, of course he did. But he still goes through this process being a human being. But I like what Jesus does here, and it's something that I find that I sometimes have difficulty doing. And that is, rather than focusing on his own inconvenience, the fact that he was trying to get away and all these people followed him. I'm frustrated. I'm annoyed with these people. Leave me alone for half a second. Jesus' focus is not on his own frustrations, but it's on the needs of this crowd. So as an application for us, and especially for me, instead of being bothered by a person or people's presence when I would rather depart into a desolate place, I should take this attitude on that Jesus has, and I ought to consider the needs and the opportunities that I have to serve this person or people, the ones who God has put in front of me. I may have a desire to get away and be by myself. God may have another thing that he wants me to accomplish. And so, if that is something that happens to us, rather than just being a pouty poo, negative Nancy, and being like, I can't, I'm frustrated with you because you followed me and I'm trying to be alone. Look at that person's needs and ask the question, why has God put this person in front of me in this particular situation? Even though I felt like the best thing was for me to get away from everything. Good application there, especially for us introverts. All right, verses 15 through 21. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go to the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." And they said to him, We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So the day is quickly passing away here, and the apostles are concerned for the people. They're like, they've got to go home, and we don't, they haven't anything to eat. They probably want something to eat, and so we should send them away so that they can go take care of their daily provisions, their hunger issues. And Jesus looks back at them, and he says, "Oh, there's no need. You feed them." And it's interesting that the Bible doesn't record a lot of the personal expressions of the people, but doesn't describe that there was just an awkward pause at this point, or that the apostles laughed, thinking that Jesus was joking with them. But there must have been some kind of shocking response, shocked response that the apostles would have had, is he being sarcastic? Is this a joke? Obviously, we can't feed 5,000 people. Jesus, of all people, knew that they didn't have the bread and they didn't have the money just to pull off a task like that. But he asked them here to do the impossible. So what do the apostles do? I think the response of the apostles is really important to consider. They start taking an inventory of their resources and determine that it can't be done. We've looked at what we have, checked our pockets for loose change. We don't have enough money to do this. John chapter 6, verse 6 tells us that Jesus said this to them to test them. And you think, test them for what? What's he getting at here? And I think it's probably a test as to where they believe their sufficiency to carry out God's commands comes from. If God asks you to do something, where are you going to look first? I think that's the idea. And that's an important question for us to ask as well as we look at this application in a second. In chapter 10, Jesus had given the apostles the power to heal the sick, cast out demons, raise the dead, do all of these things. And he's asked them here to feed 5,000 men. And they immediately look at their wallets and proclaim, it can't be done. Did the money in their wallets help them cast out the demons and heal the sick people? No. And yet they're not looking back at Jesus to give them that power now. Instead, they're evaluating their resources. And they should have looked at Jesus and said, "Okay, Show us how to do it. You want us to do this? Show us how to do it. You want us to raise the dead? Show us how. Jesus gave them power to do that. Here, Jesus said, go feed 5,000 people. Okay, how do you want us to do it? So think about some application. How often does God tell us to accomplish something, and we come back to him with a personal inventory and tell him, can't do it? How many times do we read a command in the Bible and we say, yeah, I know it says this, but I don't have enough money. I don't have enough talent. We don't have the kind of resources in this congregation to pull that off. We don't have the time to do it. We don't have the skill sets to do it, the expertise. All these things we think, we can't do it. Jesus tells us to reach the world, and we're like, well, how does he expect us to do that? So we look at all of our inventory, what we have, and instead of reading God's commands in the Bible and responding to every one of them as, okay, show me how. A lot of times we're like, open our wallet, like, nope, can't be done. So we either change the command or we somehow make it say less than what it actually says. And what we ought to do is what the apostles ought to have done, looked back at Jesus. Of all people who knows what's possible for a human being to accomplish, it's Jesus, because he made the human beings and he knows what they're capable of, and he knows what's in all their pockets and in all their minds. And if he looks at you and says, you go do this, I know it's impossible. What do you need to do? You look back at Jesus and be like, okay, give me what I need. And I think the consistent message of the scriptures is he's more than willing to do that. It's not, well, let me stay on my notes. I'm gonna get off time and mess this all up. But 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 talks about how God uses us to accomplish his work, but it's not on our own power that we accomplish that work. It's through God's power working in us. Why? 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, so that we can see, just as the apostles are learning, that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. God asks us to do big things, and we look at ourselves and we're like, I can't do it. So who do we have to look back at? We have to look at Jesus. And when we accomplish it, we have to look back at Jesus and said, this one's on you. You did this. You accomplished this because I knew that I couldn't. And when we think like that, our spiritual accomplishments will not be pride-inducing. They'll be faith-building and motivate us to do things in the future that are even bolder or even bigger. And so we'll get on to that a little bit later. But I'll stay on the notes. God does not care about your empty wallet. In fact, your empty wallet probably makes you a more ideal candidate in the eyes of God to do great things. You think about the people who God used in the Bible. They weren't rich. They weren't noble. They were humble. They came from backgrounds where you wouldn't think anybody great would come from. And yet God used them for tremendous things. Same thing here. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, says Paul, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. When I surrender my own strength and admit it, hand it over as feeble, as just one man's hands in 7 billion on an earth that I can't even, I'm a tiny speck on. When I can hand that over to God and say, I don't really have any strength. I want your strength in its place. That's when God can use us. Boast in your weakness and know that God will fill you up with the power you need. Jesus is about to remind his apostles of his sufficiency to enable them to serve others. And Jesus uses something ordinary in this text, 5 loaves, 2 fish, right? That's pretty ordinary, especially for that time. He uses something ordinary to accomplish something extraordinary, feeding 5,000 plus people. Not only does he do that, but he leaves behind a message of reminder that this isn't the extent of his grace. This isn't the extent of what he can do. Because what happens? There's 12 baskets that are left over here. One for each apostle to pick up and perhaps to remember for all time that God isn't low on supply of grace to accomplish impossible things. God has a storehouse of more power than we could ever possibly use if we were all the most God-reliant Christians in the world. He's not running low on supply. And when he does the impossible through the ordinary, he's still got so much potential. If only someone ordinary will come and work for him and take on his competence and leave their incompetence in humility. The 12 baskets ought to encourage us that when we've thought we've dreamed big enough, to dream a bit bigger for the glory of God. When we thought we had we pushed ourselves this year or last year, our congregation this year or last year, we accomplished something big by God's power. Dream bigger the next year. Why? God's got 12 baskets of grace that he needs to dump on you in order to enable you to do what he has called you to do. All right, verses 22 through 23. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, punctuation. Let me read that again. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. Jesus didn't have any time earlier in the day to pray, and so he made time in the evening. Interesting. We'll look at that point in a second. Remember from the last few verses that the day was quickly growing old when Jesus fed the 5,000, and the apostles wanted to send the people away to go find food. If you're like me, you may have been wondering, well, what time was it? Because now they're getting in a boat and they're sailing back home. It sounds like it might be pretty late at night. Just some fun facts here, geographic fun facts. The Sea of Galilee is about 33 miles in circumference. There's actually a trail called the Sea of Galilee Trail, which is a 35-mile trek all around the lake. And so if you ever find yourself, for some reason, in Galilee, you may take the 35-mile trail and get your exercise. Burn off all the bread you just ate at the feeding of the 5,000. So for reference, looking at the map above in your notes, it's probably about 5 miles from Bethsaida to Capernaum. So they have to still make this journey to get back home. The apostles returned home via boat, but Jesus stayed on the mountain to pray, which I think says a lot about his priorities. Jesus could have said, I've been up early. I've been dealing with all these people. I know I didn't have time to be alone earlier when I wanted to, but it's late now, and so I'm not going to go commune with God now because I'm tired. Instead, what does he do? He stays up late to have that time in prayer. Probably a lesson there for us in terms of, and we talked about this before, have we ever sacrificed our physical needs like sleep or food in order to fill ourselves with spiritual food and with those necessities of our spiritual life? Something we ought to do, something we see Jesus doing. All right, and then verses 24 through 27. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not fear." I am looking at my notes and I feel like I am missing a few verses. I'm missing verses 28 through 33. Let me add these in here really quick so that you'll have a complete set of notes and so that we can actually read what's going on here. Okay, so what we've talked about, that didn't work. Copy, paste. Okay, so the apostles are out on their ship. They are being beaten by the wind, and they're not getting very far. Jesus comes walking on the sea, and this is what happens next, verse 28 through 33. And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God. Check my time here. Okay, so we are told in John chapter 6, verse 17, that the apostles were headed back to Capernaum. So they're going home. But the wind was hindering their progress. And just for you meteorologists out there, this is probably not the same wind that was hitting them, or the same weather phenomenon that was hitting them when they were about to sink and Jesus has to calm the storm. Why? Because this wind is against them when they're headed to Capernaum. So which direction are they headed? Think about your map. They're headed from Bethsaida to Capernaum, the west. They're going west. In the other occurrence, in I think it was chapter 8, where Jesus calms the storm, they're headed east. They're headed to the Gadarenes to heal the man who has the demon. And that wind is coming off the Golan Heights, which is the northeast part of the Sea of Galilee. It's hitting their boat, and it's contrary to them. Now, if it had been that same wind in this situation, it would have been pushing them along, and they would have made it home in record time. But it's not. This is probably much more of a typical storm, and there's just some wind, and it's contrary to them, and so it's making their job really hard. So if you care about meteorology, there you go. That is thanks to the Lexham Geographic Commentary on the Gospels, which is quickly becoming my favorite book. I think I did this. Okay. Jesus then has been up on the mountain, leaving the mountain. He walked out to meet the apostles, and we say that so casually. I just walked out there. He walks out on the sea, and he meets the apostles in the boat, and they're struggling along. The time is given as the 4th hour of the night. So we were wondering about what time this was and how long it was going to take them to get home, and we never answered that question. So we're not going to answer it. It's the 4th hour of the night. The Romans divided the night into 4 different watches, or if you've ever seen a movie, you've probably seen, like, if there's people wandering through the wilderness and they're in danger or something, and they say to one of their compatriots, they're like, you take the first watch and I'll take the second watch, and they stay up and watch for trouble. Well, that's probably where this comes from as well. There were 4 different watches. The first one started at 6 p.m., ended at 9 p.m., 3 hours. The next one, 9 p.m. to 12. The next one, 12 a.m. to 3. And the 4th watch, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So what time is it when Jesus is out walking on the water? It's like the middle of the night. So this was a late night for Jesus and definitely for his apostles. The apostles initially thought that Jesus was a ghost, and that might have been because they were a little bit sleep deprived, but also it's not every day that you see somebody walking to you in the middle of a windstorm on a large body of water. So I can't really fault them for that, but that's what they think. They're kind of terrified. They've never seen Jesus do this before, apparently. Jesus calms their fears by revealing himself to them, at which point Peter asks to join him on the water. And he moves. You notice how quickly Peter moves from fear to participation. He's terrified at one point that the ghost is coming after him. And then he's like, Lord, let me jump out and walk on the water too. You have to love Peter. But let's think about some applications on this text. I think I might just be missing something in my notes here. Let's talk about this a little bit more, because it doesn't end with Peter jumping out of the boat, obviously. What happens to Peter? I'm going to add these in before I upload them. But so in verse 29, Jesus said, come. So Peter got out of the boat, and he walked on the water, and he came to Jesus. But what happens? Peter's walking, and he's doing well, and then he starts looking around, and there's all this wind and these waves around him, and he starts to allow them to kind of get in his head, and he takes his eyes off Jesus, and he begins to sink. And so Jesus has to come and save him and pull him out of the water, and he admonishes him, and he says, if you have little faith, why did you doubt? You were doing well, you had your eyes fixed on me, and then you doubted, and then you sank, and I had to come pick you up. But then he takes Peter back to the boat, and the apostles worship, and they say, truly you are the Son of God. A confession that we will see Peter make in chapter 16 in a few days. But, okay, so let's think about some application now. We should be careful before we criticize Peter for sinking in the sea. I've heard many times people who are a little bit harsh on Peter because they're like, oh, Peter, you were walking on the water. Why on earth did you start doubting and sink? And they're almost ragging on Peter for failing to do this. And admittedly, I used to kind of share that same attitude. But when we look at our lives, we look at this example, we look at the church, and I think the church is at a place in its history where its members are more likely to err on the side of inaction than they are on the side of action. I think we're more likely to sin by making excuses for not fulfilling our God-given responsibilities than to sin because we're just so zealous, we're so ambitious, we're so go-get-em about accomplishing the work of God that we overstep or we step out of line, right? Usually, I think, for most churches, and I think you would confirm this, it's probably the other way around, that our churches are just kind of locked in their building. They're not really fulfilling the Great Commission. They're not really fulfilling the responsibilities that Christ has given us. And so we err on the side of inaction rather than on the side of action. We're really good at making excuses for why Jesus' words don't really demand of us what it sounds like they're demanding of us. And we're really good at looking down our noses at people who we think are kind of irresponsibly zealous. And we can make excuse for why we're not like that because we're like, oh, they're irresponsible. They're not wise in the way that they're handling their zeal or their devotion to God. And so we've become pretty good at that. I think we have room to learn from Peter's zeal in this text, even though he sank. And we're going to look at that in a second. But, it's not, well, it can be sinful to take action, but it can also be sinful to fail to take action. And I would rather fail trying than I would... I have it written nicely here. Let me read that again. I would rather fail trying than being found failing to try. I'd rather have Christ come and find me trying my best and failing at something than have him, find me sitting on my couch and I'm like, well, Lord, I just didn't do it because I knew I'd fail. Right? That's not who I want to be. And Peter is a good example of that. He fails, but he fails in the process of doing something. So think about this application as well, as we'll tie these together a little bit. Fix your eyes on Jesus in midst of the storm. So Peter's mistake came when he looked away from Jesus and he allowed the voice of the wind and the waves to speak louder to him than what Jesus had told him to do. Jesus had told him to come, and Jesus, with his voice, with his words, had power over all that surrounded Peter, right? We already learned that in chapter 8, where with a word, Jesus calmed the entire sea. You remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. He says, "And be not afraid of them that kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both body and soul in hell." The waves and the water couldn't have killed Peter, but he allowed their threat to get into his head. Jesus had absolute control of everything that was around them in that situation. They could not have killed Peter. And yet he lets their voice speak louder than the one who created all of those things. And as we go through our lives and our storms, there will be voices that the devil uses, threats of dangers and threats of anxieties that the devil will use, and he will make their voice as loud as possible to drown out the voice of the Creator in our heads when those events come upon us. And he'll try to get us to listen to the voice of the threats rather than to the voice of the one who controls and keeps all of those threats in check. So you may hear the voices of disease or of your enemies or of natural disasters, of anxieties, and all these things are beating on us as the wind beat on the ship here. And again, Jesus' voice spoke all these things into existence, and he has control over all of them. And he tells Peter, what does he say to him? He says, come. Jesus says, come. Come to me through the waves, and come to me through the disease, and come to me through all of your anxiety, and come to me through your pain. And what? I will give you rest. None of these things are going to sink your ship or drown you in the water or in the storm of your life. And so what is the application that we need from this text? Let the voice of Jesus be the clearest and the most resounding voice in your head, and rest on the reality that it's his word that speaks all into existence, and it's him that cares for us and keeps everything that he has created in line in order to work out the salvation of his saints. There's no wave, no gust of wind that escapes the boundaries for which God sets for it. And that's important. And it's a beautiful thing to know that Jesus is going to lift us up and bring us to safety when we believe the voices of Satan's threats rather than his. When they're louder and we start to listen to them and we fail, we turn away and our faith falters, it's fantastic reassurance to know that he's going to lift us up out of that water. So before you're critical of Peter, realize that we can't criticize Peter because all of us have sunk in the sea. All of us at one point in our lives have listened to the voices of the threats and of Satan rather than the voice of our God who's made us the promises. And so we've all sunk in the sea. So when you look at Peter here, we don't really have any room to criticize. He's just doing in a more observable way what all of us have done. Sometimes in an observable way, sometimes in a hidden way. All right, another application. Can I do it in 2.5 minutes? I don't know. We aren't told the response of the other apostles. So think about this. This is an angle that we don't always look at when we think about this text. What are the other apostles thinking when Peter's jumping out of the boat? Because they're not jumping out of the boat with him, right? So we're not told what their response was. Some of them were probably impressed by Jesus' faith. They were like, what? Maybe I should have done that, Some of them probably thought he was a nut. Like, who's this crazy guy jumping out in the sea? He's insane. Others probably watched with skepticism and thought, yeah, sure, he jumped out of the boat. Will he let go of the side? Will he continue walking? How far will he go? I bet he won't make it very far. And then there are others who probably even gloated when they saw Peter sink. I knew that was going to happen. I mean, who does he think he is? But one thing that's really interesting and that I kind of love about Peter is that he doesn't seem to ask their opinion. He's not like, hey guys, you think I should jump out there and walk on the water with Jesus? He's having a conversation with Jesus, and these guys are just like on the side. Jesus says come, and he's like, all right, there I go. Doesn't ask for their opinion. And his decision was based on the relationship and the faith that he had in Christ. And our decision to come to Jesus needs to be based on the same thing. I can assure you that you're going to experience all of these potential attitudes that we just talked about in your Christian life if you're serious about your pursuit of Christ. Some people are going to look at you and they're going to be impressed by your faith, and they're going to be inspired by what you do. There's going to be some people who just think you're crazy. It's like, that guy, he's got issues. He follows Jesus a little bit too radically. Some people are going to say, well, he's zealous now, but we'll see if that lasts. We'll see if he doesn't burn out somewhere. We'll see if he lets go of the side of the ship. And then there's going to be some people who love to see you fail. That their greatest joy is going to be somebody who tried to appear more zealous than them, fail and sink in a sea of unbelief or of difficulty, struggle, the devil's trials, whatever it may be. But like Peter, we ought not to let the opinions of those who aren't even willing to step out of the boat sway our determination to follow Jesus' call, right? If we believe something needs to be done, we feel like we're compelled by God to do it. If Jesus says come, the opinions of those around us, no matter how intimately involved in our lives they are, their opinions just don't matter. We need to follow what Christ is calling us to do rather than listening to all these influences. And there will be people who are inspired, although there will also be people who are hostile against what we're doing. And so in a final application of this text, it's better to be admonished after having tried and failed than to receive no feedback because you've taken no action. Some people never move past their fear and into a participatory role because they're afraid they may mess up. Oh no, my camera just died. I still have the audio. I'm literally 2 minutes from finishing. I'm not charging the battery. Okay, application. You're just going to believe that I'm here. Have faith. have blind faith that I'm actually still here. You can hear my voice. Sorry, just destroyed that. Many people never move past their fear and into a participatory role because they're afraid that they may mess up. And so they're always on the sideline. They're always in the boat with everybody else. What does the parable of the talents in the Gospels teach us about whether it's better to try and fail or try and struggle or not try at all? Remember the person who had only one talent? What happened? He didn't even try, and the master condemned him for it. And he said, I would have at least had you try, even if you weren't a tremendous success at trying. And so God would rather, and I think this is backed up by biblical precedent, God would rather see us try and struggle than not try at all. And so while, yes, Peter does get admonished, I think in this case, it's better to be admonished than for God to not even have anything to correct us about because we aren't doing anything. Right? We want to be in that refining, that growing process that is talked about in the book of Hebrews and how God chastises or disciplines those who he loves. We want to be in that refining process, God making us into who we want to be. And sometimes that requires admonition. You know how you won't grow? By never taking any chances or any risks and never, fearing admonishment more than you fear never becoming the person who God has made you to be. So good on Peter for walking out in the storm and getting corrected by Jesus. All right, last couple verses here. I'm still here, I promise. Maybe I'll put up like a screenshot, a nice picture of my face. Or maybe I'll put up old video and just like lip dub it like in those Japanese Godzilla movies and you won't even know. I'll just put like subtitles over it. and when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well. Okay, so Gennesaret, this is the end of this chapter. Good thing, too. Gennesaret does not refer to a city, but it actually refers to a plain, like an area of land. And according to my favorite book, the Lexham Geographic Commentary on the Gospels, Gennesaret was a fertile plain stretching 3.5 miles long and 1.5 miles deep on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. And so there's the map down below, and it sat between the area of Capernaum and Tiberias. I didn't actually know Tiberias was a city that bordered the Sea of Galilee until I studied for this class. But where the yellow arrow is there, that's actually it's labeled also. That's where the plain of Gennesaret was. And so this is where Jesus lands, and it was an area pretty close to Capernaum. And so all the people in that region come, and they are healed by Christ by touching the fringe of his garment. You have to wonder if the first woman with the issue of blood had kind of inspired this touching of the hem of the garment. Later, this is going to be done with the apostles' garments too. But that's the end of chapter 14. And so even though you can't see me, I'm still here, and I'm thankful, hopefully, that you're still here as well. And just remember, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Remember to share this study and use the notes if you want to help somebody else study, or use them in a Bible class or whatever. And share the videos. Comment down below. Thank you for all those who have encouraged me in the comments. And get the book online, What is the Bible? 2BeLikeChrist.com. Drop down in the link and grab that. And I'll see you guys in the next one. And maybe, hopefully, you'll see me in the next one too, in chapter 15.